I am Dr. Darrell Ezell. I am the director for the MA in Interfaith Action of Religion, Culture, and Foreign Affairs here at Claremont Lincoln University. Thank you for joining us today for this Digital Roundtable. On December 2nd, 2015, 14 people were killed and 22 injured in a terrorist attack consisting of a mass shooting at the Inland Regional Center in San Bernardino, California. Saeed Farouk and wife Tashfeen Malik targeted a Department of Public Health holiday party of about 80 guests. Since the December 2nd attack, we've witnessed high emotions led by fear. Many solutions presented publicly are reactive, superficial, and often downright mean-spirited. What is needed today more than ever before is an alternative to hate speech and Islamophobia. Claremont Lincoln University is a 21st century graduate institution that teaches the contemporary skills needed to create sustainable social change. We have an extraordinary panel with us this morning to explore how communities may work together to promote peace. We have with us Dr. Stephanie Varnon-Hughes, who is the Director of Cross-Cultural and Interfaith Programs here at Claremont Lincoln University. Dr. Keith Augustus Burton, teaching faculty member in the Interfaith Action Program, and also he is the Director of the Center for Adventist Muslim Relations at Oakwood University in Huntsville, Alabama. Also, we have with us Dr. Ayse Kadayifci-Orellana, who is a teaching faculty member as well here in the Interfaith Action Program, an interim associate director and visiting assistant professor at Georgetown University's MA in Conflict Resolution Program. And last but not least, we have with us here in the studio Dr. Eileen Aranda, who is Claremont Lincoln University's president. At this time, Eileen, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Darrell. We'd like to shape our conversation today around something we call the Claremont Core: mindfulness, dialogue, collaboration, and change. The Claremont Core is a set of 21st century skills needed to deal with an increasingly complex world. At Claremont Lincoln University, we use these core courses to help our students shape Society 4.0, a place where we move away from self-interest to common interest, moving away from one right answer, which is usually mine, to multiple perspectives, valuing them and using them, and finally to move away from violence, indifference, and discrimination into a place where we co-create community action that brings about positive social change. So let's begin our discussion around mindfulness, that ability to reflect issues in context. Darrell, would you begin with an assessment of the changing landscape in the U.S. and globally?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Right now, I think it's so important for us to be mindful, in a sense, that the U.S. is a young nation in transition. This country is currently going through, I would like to say, a sea change around ethnic and cultural and racial issues. We've noticed very recently with a number of reports by several think tanks, the Brookings Institute in particular, came out with a report about a year or so ago that suggested that the United States of America is moving towards becoming a minority-majority nation, in the sense that by the year 2035, its predominantly white majority will soon dip into the minority. We've noticed this in 2014 with the Census Bureau's report that nearly 50 to 51% of all youth that were born before 2014 are now, or after 2014, are pretty much, they comprise the minority-majority dynamic, in a sense. What is happening right now is a realization that there is frustration taking place, the loss of power and privilege in American society, the reality that religion is a form of public expression. We are now learning how to communicate and engage with one another. But most importantly here in the U.S., what is so challenging is that we have Gen Xers and millennials who are moving away from traditional institutions. Reports are coming out that's stating that a number of millennials identify themselves as being spiritual but not religious. They're moving away from traditional academic institutions, traditional social institutions, and they're finding their way. They're searching for arenas of inclusivity and diversity. With that said, we see protests that are cropping up, whether in Baltimore or Ferguson, in Florida, Oakland, the list goes on and on. So this country is shifting and changing. The political landscape is shifting, the tone is different. We see political leaders that are more concerned about raising their favorability rating than being concerned about the aspirations and perspectives of those individuals who are non-elite at the grassroots level. The global landscape is a little different. We notice now that there is a new type of actor cropping up. In international relations, they consider these actors to be non-state actors. So terrorism is a big deal now. 10, 15, roughly 20 years ago, we didn't really see as many terrorist attacks as we see now, or terrorist threats that we see now. So in Nigeria, there's the threat of Boko Haram. In parts of the Arab and Muslim world, we see Al-Qaeda. So all of these groups that are cropping up now, forcing state actors and political leaders to understand religion, elements around culture and ethnicity a little bit better. So the landscape, both here in the United States and abroad, is shifting and changing.
Stephanie, given what Darrell has said about all these changes within our society, give us your perspective on what we need for interfaith and cross-cultural understanding.
Right, so here's what we know about learning, whether that's interfaith learning or cross-cultural learning. All real learning is preceded by disequilibrium, by dissonance. We have the world figured out, or so we think, we have our worldview, we encounter something new, new information, new experience, new relationship, and that provokes dissonance. It provokes a state of disequilibrium. And then when we incorporate that new information or new relationship or new experience into our existing worldview, then we have truly learned something. So that's natural, that's part of being human. Also part of being human is being in conflict. Even healthy communities, healthy relationships, conflict is a part of our daily lives. So one thing that really truncates human flourishing and keeps us from having whole and peaceful relationships is when we remain in that state of fear and reactivity. So when we encounter new information, or we encounter crisis, or we encounter tragedy, that feeling of fear is natural. It's a natural first response. But what happens when fear floods our brains is we can no longer think creatively or think critically. And those two capacities, to think creatively and think critically, are what it takes to build relationship and build community and build a civic space. So interreligious leaders, religious leaders, civic leaders, educators, we have the opportunity to help shepherd our communities through that place of disequilibrium into a more flourishing place of relationship, dialogue, collaboration, and change.
So the problems, the issues that both of you have brought to the surface are complex ones. They really require nuance and definition more than just one brushstroke that paints a whole group of people or one bucket or one simple answer. One way we can learn about these different points of view and perspectives is through dialogue, the balance of advocacy and inquiry, where we really seek to understand, though not necessarily agree with, other people's points of view. Keith, you write and speak a lot about ideological violence and hate speech. Why are these skills of dialogue important?
You know, Eileen, sometimes when we think about violence, we think strictly in terms of physical violence. And with physical violence, the effects are clearly seen, broken bones or black eyes or sometimes destroyed property. But there are other types of violence. And as I think of a type of violence that I think is playing out a lot on a global sphere, I think of the old playground ditty, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me. And we know that's just not true. The truth is, when we think of how violence is expressed, one of the worst types of violence is the psychological violence. We know that many marriages end because of verbal abuse. Many children are victims of verbal abuse. In fact, the 1999 Columbine massacre, the young men who perpetrated that, it's believed that they got to that point of frustration because they were verbally abused, questioned about their sexuality, etc. And many people who run to join a number of these radical groups do so because of perceived verbal attacks on their religion. And so the challenge we have in our democracy is really coming to terms with the limits of free speech. Now, we do know that we're told time and time again that free speech doesn't mean that we could go into a crowded theater and shout fire, fire, fire. But, I think we need to expand our idea on what the crowded theater is. For instance, when we look at the limits of free speech, we find that in our society, free speech is often used with malicious intent. And when that
Go to Eileen.
we often take a look at the way in which hate speech is received, and we blame the person who receives the speech as being responsible for their actions. But there should also be some responsibility on the side of the one who is sending the message. And so, again, when we look at hate speech and its link between physical violence, I think that we have to admit that there is a continuum there. Now, I don't want to go on for too much longer, but you do also ask about symbolic violence. And I believe that symbolic violence is just as insidious as hate speech, and symbolic violence is oftentimes culturally endorsed. I think about the Jews in Germany before being interned in the concentration camps had to wear that dreaded Judenstern, that yellow badge that made them know that they were less than. This is an act of violence. I'm thinking about recent laws in Turkey that have been reversed, but also in France, which forbade women to wear the hijab in public, or just as terrible, Saudi Arabia and other areas of the Islamic State, where women are forced to wear the hijab and the burqa in public. These are all types of symbolic violence. So ultimately, symbolic violence and hate speech reduce the possibility for dialogue because they're often espoused by people who have absolutely no desire to talk.
Ayse, you have written about the importance of creating civil society. How can we engage in dialogue to develop a more civil society?
I think civil society is very important to change the current atmosphere of hate speech and scapegoating. And one of the ways we can do this is by engaging the resources and religious and community actors, which still play a very important role within the United States context. And these community leaders, one of the ways in which they can do is to be very mindful of the language that they use. One of the key aspects of a dialogue is a willingness to learn, and sincere willingness to learn another's perspective and understand them without trying to change them, but also be open to be changed ourselves. And also being able to be open to recognize that we may be wrong. So one way that we could do is by engaging religious leaders to have a dialogue first within their own communities. For example, within the Muslim community, there should be an intra-Muslim dialogue. Within the Christian community, there should be an intra-Christian dialogue, etc. And this dialogue should reflect not a language of fear, which contributes to escalation of the conflict, but a language of compassion and a language of understanding, because the words we use are very, very important. As we said, fear is a natural reaction, but that's what terrorism wants. That's the aim of terrorism, is to terrorize and to keep us in that place of fear. So the language that we use should try to create a more trust between communities. And one way to do this is to communicate correct and balanced information. Media and social media is filled with misinformation, rumors that are not true, which contributes to the escalation of the conflict. And how do we do that? By engaging with stories of what's happening that is constructive, that's good. So much is happening on the ground. Right now, for example, interfaith solidarity groups are doing amazing work and trying to build communities together. This is a critical time where we can take opportunity society through using our dialogue skills and through using our language that is more compassionate, more understanding, and includes a willingness to learn.
Thank you. Darrell, why don't you finish up this section by talking about your work in diplomacy and peace building and how it's addressing this increase in violence in the world.
Well, it seems that a number of interfaith leaders are recognizing that the traditional forms of interfaith just really don't work anymore with respect to just coming together and having a prayer or just praying over the situation. Now, indeed, I want to make sure that I'm respecting that context, that prayer is needed and vigils are needed, but we have to move beyond interfaith dialogue to that of interfaith action. And that basically means that interfaith leaders can work with the non-elites within society to learn about the aspirations and perspectives and create pipelines to inform political officials and community activists. With respect to diplomacy, I would argue that some of the work in the area of multi-track diplomacy in the Virginia and DC area could be helpful with interfaith work, realizing that there's a track one where governments engage with one another, but at track two, at the track two level, that's where we really see conflict resolution taking place. But there are multiple tracks, from the religious track to the business track to the financial track to the philanthropy track. And if interfaith leaders consider branching out and engaging along these multiple tracks, they can take a holistic systems approach to promoting peace within societies.
All right. So when we listen to you, one of the things that we begin to understand is that both research and experience have taught us that the lack of an ability or the opportunity to have meaningful conversation that is really results-oriented and in which I really have a chance to engage is one of the most important things that we can do to move society away from violence towards collaboration. So let's talk a little bit about collaboration. That skill that fosters co-creative problem solving. It is the process that draws everyone together, looking at their interests and moving them forward. So Stephanie, share with us some of the cross-cultural approaches to collaboration that you have seen effective.
Right, so the first thing is that collaboration can't be about doing things my way or one way. And that's one sort of trap that linguistically or even in our practice we fall into, that we're gonna set the table, we're gonna open the space for dialogue, and we have one model for it. So the skills that I see as necessary for really having fruitful collaboration include perspective-taking practice, relationship, and time for reflective practice. So the relationship piece is key because if we're in a relationship with people like us and people similar to us, then we're sort of in our own silos of orthodoxy and dogma and practice that are limited. And they really paralyze our ability to move and flourish in a diverse world. Reflective practice, because again, these periods of dissonance can heighten our anxiety in a positive way even, but reflective practice gives us time to pause, time to consider, to reconsider, and to be able to then be refreshed when we move into these global spaces. The first piece, perspective-taking practice, this is the skill or the posture or the ability to hold multiplicities of viewpoints at the same time, It's related to critical thinking. So these are practices. The first times that we try them as a community or as a religious organization or as a university or as an individual, it feels clunky. It might feel unfamiliar, but they're practices that we can engage in again and again. And leaders have the opportunity, again, to model these practices, to articulate them, and to teach them. How do we have more than one point of view at all times? It's a practice. Where can we find? And these are the things that then when we come to do something together, collaboration is.
Thank you. Might build collaboration in our communities.
Yes, absolutely. I think what Darrell said is absolutely key. We cannot just get together and not take action. One of the keys for effective collaboration is to translate those into action through a participatory process where all those involved in the process should be included in the decision making. So what we could do is collaborate with people from other groups to find out what is our common interest, what are some of our common values, but also identify where we differ, and we should differ respectfully. And these differences should be a source of learning rather than some points of contention. I think that's very important. After we have identified our key areas that we could find as common ground, we have to identify what are our interests and goals, and how do we get together and put that into practice? Do we need to build a joint community center, for example? What does that mean? How does it translate into bringing people together? So the action component is very, very important, but also the attitude, having multiple perspectives, being respectful to difference is very important. Joint other activities, celebrations together is also important. But I think identifying core community needs and working to resolve them together is key to creating a sense of a broader family, broader community perspective, which could bring us together rather than divide us.
Great, thank you. Keith, share with us some of the collaboration strategies that you've seen working in the interfaith community.
Well, you know, listening to Stephanie and Ayse, I could just say ditto, ditto, ditto. You know? But definitely a mutual respect for our differences. I mean, we are different, which is the reason why we are who we are. And but also recognizing that there are enough commonalities among us to develop common ground. In fact, a term I like to use when dealing with interfaith is accidental birth. I am who I am because of where I was born. You know, had I been born in Iran or in, you know, northern Nigeria, I could have been someone completely different right now. And so recognizing that there are some things that shape our ideologies that are way beyond our control. Now, my personal experiences with Christian-Muslim relations, and some things I've found to be very helpful once we recognize that, yes, there are some differences that we have as Christians and Muslims, but there are also some commonalities. And on agreeing with those commonalities, I've had some very interesting discussions. I've sat at a table with Muslims both nationally and internationally, dealing with such topics as paradise, you know, as peace. You know, in fact, we had a conference at the Oakland University campus last year when we dealt with Islamic visions of peace, looking at the ways in which we can take the common understanding of current peace and future peace to build better societies. And now it's very easy for us to get bogged down in conversations about intricate and idiosyncratic differences. But the tough task that we have in collaboration is putting aside those differences that we know are there for the sake of finding a better path for society. And I believe that this is an engagement that is worth it.
Great, thank you. So when I listen to all of you, one of the things that really seemed to come to the forefront is that talking, no matter how earnest, is not usually enough to satisfy people's needs, desires for improvement. Bringing about change, being a change agent is actually at the heart of transforming society. So I'd like to ask each one of you, what is the is a little bit strong, the single most important thing that you would share with our viewers today that you think needs to happen in order for us to progress in our society? Why don't we start with you, Darrell?
The first, the single, multiple perspectives, but the single most important thing is that we learn how to dismantle and also recognize moral conflict. You know, these moral conflicts are not new. These are long-standing conflicts, they're incommensurate, they're intractable conflicts that are deep-seated and deeply rooted within society. Some folks would even call them, culture wars and cultural conflicts, but we have to learn how to train our eyes to recognize their development. And if we can train our eyes to recognize that development, then we can learn how to work through and negotiate with moral conflict. Because when we talk about terrorism, when we talk about violence against gay and transgender, or violence against various religious and ethnic groups, we're talking about moral conflict. So in this society today, we have to learn how to recognize when too far is too far. And that means leaders and officials, interfaith actors, calling out toxic conversations in the public sphere. So it's wrong, yes, it is wrong to say that all Muslims are a certain way, or all Hindus are a certain way, or blacks, whites, whatever the case might be. So we have to call out these narratives that will help us move towards an inclusive society, in my opinion.
Great, good. Keith, what about you? What's the one thing that you would recommend that people do to become a more inclusive, less violent society?
I think it's important for us to be honest about the violence to which we have already been desensitized. We're often upset when violence is perpetrated by the other, but we're blinded to the fact that we're living in a society with ingrained institutionalized violence. For example, we see this recent hashtag Black Lives Matter, and many people think it's much about nothing, but no, it's a response to systemic violence that have hurt black and brown and poor communities for many, many years. And we are living in a society where we see the increased militarization of the police force, and no one really says anything about it. And of course, we're getting to the point now where the type of violence that is being inflicted against these disenfranchised community is what I refer to as the violence of domination. And oftentimes when we see this violence of domination, it's responded to by the violence of frustration, and this often manifests in riots when people tear up their own neighborhoods, etc. And sometimes we pull our hair out wondering why does this happen. But as Martin Luther King said, oftentimes when we see these riots, it's really the language of the unheard. But unfortunately, we become so desensitized again that we just allow these riots to play themselves out. We know that they sort of have an expiration date, and we get back to normal. And I could talk about our desensitization to military violence. We don't cringe when we hear terms like shock and awe and overwhelming military force and people relegated to collateral damage. And it's about, we just don't learn from history. And so now, how are we going to deal with the ISIS threat? Well, the recent CNN poll said that 60% of Americans support boots on the ground again. It just doesn't work. And, we find violence to be okay when it's against them, but not us. And I'm thinking of a statement by Malcolm X, very controversial. He poignantly mentioned that chickens do come home to roost. And unless we're honest about our role in propagating violence and begin to hold our leaders accountable while showing them a better way, we will never see the type of change that brings about the type of society that we all envision.
Great, sobering words. Stephanie, what would be the one change you would advocate for?
I wish that my recommendation were something as simple as learning a recipe or even learning a language, that once you have the recipe, you can do it and you know what you're going to get. And instead, my recommendation is a posture of uncertainty, being comfortable not knowing. We teach and preach and practice certainty and conclusion. But being human is not about having certainty and conclusion. Being human is a messy, fraught endeavor. And to think that we know how to behave in one situation and replicate that is folly. We're setting ourselves up to be uncomfortable and to be frightened, to not be in relationship. So I would love a time when our educational system and our media system, instead of tuning in for 30 seconds and getting the knowledge, instead was an opportunity to wonder, to question, to have a posture of curiosity. If I see Darrell on the bus, I think I know Darrell, right? My mind linguistically is checking off the things I think I know about him. And that's because the way that we teach and learn to be human right now in society is to make judgments as quickly as we can and act on those judgments. And instead, I encourage us to teach and model and practice postures of not knowing, of wonder, of questioning, of curiosity. How are you like me? How are you not like me? What more can we find? What more can we know together? So that's my recommendation.
Great. That's a hard one.
That's a hard one. We can do it.
Ayse, what would you tell us as the one thing we should change?
I think it is important for us to be more empathetic listeners. One of the things that we don't always do is to listen others attentively. When we're listening, or we look like we're listening, what we're really doing is preparing what we would like to respond. And we already have conceived assumptions about the other. And that is actually a communication blocker that is preventing us to actually learning about each other in the true sense. And to have empathy is not to change who you are or your opinions, but try to understand where is the other person is coming from. That doesn't mean that I have to change who I am, what I think, or my values, but to be able to understand why another person is thinking that way. What are some of the reasons of that behavior, that action, can help us build a more compassionate, more cooperative, and more understanding societies built on trust. So my recommendation would be to have more skills or teach and practice empathetic listening.
Oh, thank you. All right, so I heard two different kinds of recommendations coming forward. One is about the skills, the communication skills, the engagement skills that we need to have. Reflect, pause, think about what other people are saying, not be afraid to understand what they are saying. And the second is to challenge our own mindset and to not stand for behaviors that are not the kind of behaviors that we want as part of our society. So all of those resting within the individual. Well, that concludes our discussion, and I want to thank all of our viewers for joining us for this roundtable discussion on how to build communities of peace. I also want to thank our distinguished panel members, Darrell, Stephanie, Keith, Ayse, for sharing your expertise with us. We talked a lot about habits, practices, and clearly it's a day-to-day task. It doesn't just happen. So we invite each of you to take one of the things that you heard today in our discussion and to make it a habit. If you want to learn more about Claremont Lincoln University, we also invite you to visit our website. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.